In this video, we're going to be talking about the Civil AccuDraw civil rules dealing with horizontal geometry. Civil rules are basically constraints based on how that item was placed if you're using Civil AccuDraw along with the civil geometry placement tools. And to demonstrate this, for my first example, I'm going to make sure I have my Open Roads Modeling workflow selected. I'm going to come to my Geometry ribbon, and from the horizontal group, I'm going to select my Point tool. And the feature definition I'm going to use for this example, if I select a down arrow, I'm just going to use the land corner symbol under Design, Right of Way, and Land Corner. Using the horizontal tools and selecting a feature definition will allow me to add constraints and use other tools with this civil element. If I were to place this cell just using standard MicroStation drawing tools, I wouldn't be able to use some of the other civil tools we'll be using to modify this element. So for this example, I'm going to make sure my Civil AccuDraw is turned on, and I'm going to use my Station and Offset option to place this cell. So the first thing I need to do, I need to go out to my keyboard and hit the letter O key. It's going to have me select a reference element. I'm going to select this lower line down here. And since this line was drawn from here to here, the station up here is going to be 0, and it's going to increase moving down the line. So for my station, I'm just going to use 5 plus 0, 0, and hit enter to lock that in. And maybe for my offset, I'll use 90 feet. Depending on which side my cursor's on is which side it's going to offset to. So I'm going to leave it on the upper side, type in 90, hit enter to lock it in, left click to accept it, and I have that land corner cell placed. So I'm going to right click to reset my tool, and I'm finished. So now if I just go out and select that point, you can see that there are some civil rules attached to that point based on how I drew that element. I used a 90-foot offset, and I put it at station 5 plus 0, 0. So now if I need to change either of those values, maybe I wanted my offset to be 100 feet, I could just left click on that 90 feet text, type in 100, hit enter, and it's going to dynamically change that distance. Of course, I could do the same thing on the stationing as well. I could left click on that stationing. Maybe for the stationing I wanted it to be 6 plus 50. Type that in, hit enter, and it's going to move it to that new station. So as long as I place that point with the civil rules, I can dynamically change those elements. And it's the same for this point I placed in the earlier exercise. If I select this point here, you'll notice it has rules tied to it. If I wanted to change one of these rules, I could just select that item. Maybe I want to change the 200 feet to 190 feet. So I will just type in 190, hit enter, and you can see it moved that point. Also, if I go out and select one of these lines, and I'm just going to go up to one of these handles, left click and hold my mouse button and drag it out a little bit, and when I let go, you'll notice those points moved because the civil rule tried to stay tied to this line even though I modified it. Now there are ways to break that rule. If I come up here and select this point, with any civil object, these little dots right here are what Bentley calls a manipulator. If I hover over that point, it should pop up a little thing that says move point. So if I left click and hold my mouse button and move that point, I just dynamically moved it and let go. Now if I go back and select that element, you'll notice there are no longer any civil rules tied to that element. Another example of using civil rules, if I come up to my lines and I select this line between points. So first I'm going to set my feature definition, and for my feature definition I'm going to come in here and select linear design. I'm going to go to right away. I'm going to expand parcels, I'm going to select this one that's called New Right-of-Way Controlled Access. So now I have my feature definition selected. Now for this example, I'm going to use this top line right here and pretend that's my roadway center line. So now I want to make sure I'm using my station and offset mode in Civil AccuDraw. So I'm going to make sure I have that one selected. Now I'm going to hit the letter O on my keyboard so I can select my reference element. I'm going to use this line right here. So maybe for my station, I want to start it at 1 plus 0, 0. So I'll enter that, lock it in. For my offset, maybe I want it to be 90 feet. So I enter that and lock it in. Left click to start my line. For my next vertex, maybe I want it to be at station 3 plus 50. So I'll enter that and lock it in. And for my offset, maybe I want it to be 125 feet. So I will enter 125 and lock that one in. And left click to accept it. For my next line, I'm just going to snap to the end of the previous line. I'm going to hit the letter O on my keyboard again. Select my reference element again. I'm going to tab up to my station. Maybe this time I want my station to be 7 plus 0, 0. So I'll enter and lock that one in. And for my offset, maybe I'll use 160 feet for that. So I'll type in 160, hit enter to lock that one in, and left click to accept it. Now for my last line, I'll just snap to the endpoint of the previous line I created. I'll hit the letter O on my keyboard again. Select my reference element one more time. Tab back up to station. Maybe this time I want my station to be 10 plus 50. So I'll type that in, enter to lock it in. Now maybe for my offset, this time I want 80 feet. So I'll enter an 80, enter to lock that one in, and left click to accept that line. Now if I go out and use my element selection tool and just select these lines, you can see they have civil rules applied to them. And of course this line here only has civil rules applied to the center line here because the beginning of the line was based off of that first line. And the same thing for the next line. It only has civil rules tied to the center line from that last vertex. So now if I were to go out and move this line, I just select it and dynamically drag it, you can see the other lines I've created are moving with it. Now if I want to make all these elements join together and make them one element, all I'd have to do is come up to this complex geometry tool, select the first option, complex by element. The first thing I need to do is set my feature definition. I'm going to set it to the same one I use for creating the lines. I'm going to go to linear, design, right of way, parcels, and new right-of-way controlled access line. So now it wants me to go out and locate my first element. It does matter where you pick on the element. If I hover over the element, you can see which way it's wanting to go. The arrow's pointing to the right. That's the way I want to do it. If I select it at the other end, that arrow is pointing to the left. I do not want to create my complex element that direction. So I'm going to come and left click on this end. Go to my next element, make sure the arrow's going the right way, left click on that element, and then go to the last element, make sure the arrow's going the correct way, left click on it. Then if I'm finished, I'll just left click one more time in a blank area, and I have my element. And it used that new right-of-way controlled access line to create that symbology. Now if I go out and select that line, you notice it's still tied to the center line of that roadway. And each of those points have civil rules applied to them. So that's just another example of how to create elements with civil rules.